So today we're joined by Mr. Kostas Stamoulis, who is Director of the Agricultural Development Economics Division in the FAO headquarters in Rome. So welcome to India, Kostas.
Thank you very much.
What I'd like to do is to spend a little bit of time talking to you about how the world is going to feed its growing population in the future. And perhaps we could begin by looking at the current surge in food prices. What does this surge in global food prices actually mean?
Well, the surge in global food prices has as a fundamental driving force the series of reduction in supply, starting from Russia and also weather-related events in other countries, major producing, exporting countries like, for instance, Australia, India for sugar. So fundamentally is driven by supply shocks. Now, the world found itself in the rather advantageous positions to have had stocks built fairly high following the crisis of 2007-2008. However, those stocks are being depleted, and countries are using the stocks to mediate the effects of prices, right? And so there is a fundamental issue of what will happen in 2011 in terms of global supply, and to what extent supply will be enough to meet demand and also replenish some of the stocks that have been depleted. Now, the issue, of course, of the link between financial and commodity markets, what people call speculation, is important in amplifying the volatility of prices, but not necessarily the fundamental reason for price increases and price volatility. If we go back and look a little bit at the proximate causes of the inability of the world to respond early on to this crisis, we will arrive at the fundamental lack of investment in agriculture in all its forms, from technology to infrastructure, in the developing countries that would make their agriculture flexible enough to be able to respond to the crisis. Let me remind you that as a result of the high food prices in 2007-2008, the major response to these high prices has been from the developed countries, from the OECD group. And if one excludes the big countries like India and Brazil and China from the calculation, then the rest of the developing countries took very little advantage of the high prices following the 2007-2008. And that's a fundamental problem that's due to insufficient attention to agriculture. Now, the long-term question is, one, will prices remain at those levels? Will prices remain at higher levels than before the first crisis of 2007-2008? And to what extent agriculture will be able to feed the people, which will be about 9.1 billion people in 2050. The first question is that this is a particular moment in the world markets. And so while one doesn't expect prices to stay there in the future where they are now, or where they probably going to be later on, even higher probably. However, one may see a repetition of these spikes more frequently in the future than were in the past. The second question is, we probably won't see in real terms the levels of prices that we experienced before 2006. That is, we would expect that in the next 10 to 15 years, the level of prices internationally will be about 10 to 15% higher than we experienced during the period of before 2006. So we are looking at prices at higher level for many reasons, but that have to do with, of course, demand factors and the issue of bioenergy, the issue of the growing economies that will demand more food, and especially particular foods like proteins and meats and dairy products and oils, etc. So prices will certainly be higher. In terms of the very long term, that is, what do we see in 2050? The scenario, like all the other scenarios, will depend on what kind of policies and actions we take vis-a-vis agriculture. FAO projections for the 2050 show that potentially the world will be capable of feeding itself. However, unless purposeful action is taken, we are predicting that we may end up with something like 350 million people hungry even in 2050. Now, where is the sources of growth will come from? We believe that fundamentally, in order to feed the world in 2050, we need to increase production by about 70% from the base of 2005, 2007. About 70% more food has to be produced by 2050. And we also believe that the world has the capability of producing this additional food mainly from yield growth. That is, increases in productivity will be the major contributor to the increases in food production. And about 80% overall, 20% overall will come from bringing more resources into production. As a matter of fact, the numbers are about 90% for the developing countries will be yield growth and less than 80% for the developing countries. So there is a potential to feed the world without an excessive reliance on resources like scarce resources like land and water.
Well, on that optimistic note, thank you very much for taking time to speak to us.
Thank you, Gavin.